For 30 years, she was the perfect, silent wife to a tyrant. But the day she saw a bruise on her 75-year-old mother's face, a sleeping lioness awoke. He laughed when she confronted him about hurting her mother, confident she would do nothing. He wasn't laughing when the police knocked on his door. She thought her life was over, left with nothing after divorcing her abusive husband of 30 years. She was wrong. It was just beginning. Dear friends, your comments and support mean the world to us. Tell us, what challenges have you faced in life, or maybe you're facing right now? Like this video and right where you are watching us from, we will be happy to send you our regards. So stay with us. Don't miss what's coming next. The silence in my house was a carefully curated thing. It was not the peaceful quiet of a tranquil home. It was the tense, breathless silence of a forest when a predator is near. For 30 years, I had been the curator of this silence, the zookeeper of my husband David's moods. I learned to measure the atmosphere of our home the moment I walked in the door. The way he placed his keys on the hall table, the sound of his shoes on the polished hardwood, the tension in his shoulders as he read the evening paper. I moved through my own home like a ghost, my primary purpose being to not disturb the air, to not give him a reason to shatter the fragile quiet with the thunder of his voice. I was 52 years old, but I felt ancient, worn down to a smooth, featureless stone by the relentless tide of his personality. But all of that was about to change. And it would start not with a storm, but with a quiet observation, with a single ugly mark that would upend the world I had so carefully, so miserably maintained. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I went to visit my mother, Martha. Her small, neat bungalow in the next town over had always been my only true sanctuary. It was a place where the silence was real, filled with the gentle ticking of her grandfather clock and the scent of lemon polish and baking bread. It was the only place I didn't have to be a ghost. But that day, the silence was different. It was heavy, mirroring the oppressive quiet of my own home. I found her in her favorite armchair by the window, a book open in her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was just staring out at the garden, her posture unnaturally still. She was 75, a woman who had carried the weight of the world with a spine of steel, but today she looked fragile, like a porcelain doll that had been dropped one too many times. Do you know that feeling when you know something is wrong before you can even name it? It's a cold dread that starts in your gut and spreads through your veins like ice water. That's what I felt as I crossed her living room. "Mama," I said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned to me, and for a split second, she tried to arrange her face into a welcoming smile the way she always did, but the smile faltered, collapsing under a weight I couldn't yet see. And then I saw it. Tucked just below her left cheekbone, partially hidden by the frame of her glasses, was a bruise. It was not a large mark, but its color was a violent, ugly testament to its origin. A deep, mottled purple edge with a sickly yellow-green. It was the kind of mark left not by an accidental bump into a doorframe, but by the sharp, deliberate impact of knuckles. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. The room tilted, the chintz pattern on her armchair swimming before my eyes. My heart, which had learned to beat in a slow, steady rhythm of submission, began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird, frantic and terrified. "Oh, Mama, what happened to your face?" The words were a whisper, but they sounded like a scream in the quiet room. She flinched, her hand instinctively flying up to cover the mark, a gesture of shame that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. "It's nothing, Annetta, really," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "I'm just getting clumsy in my old age. I tripped over the rug yesterday. You know how it curls up at the corner." I looked down at the rug. It lay perfectly flat against the floor. It was a lie. A clumsy, poorly constructed lie that was so out of character for my brutally honest mother that it was tantamount to a confession. We looked at each other, and in the space of that shared, silent gaze, the truth was passed between us. I knew, and she knew that I knew. I didn't need to ask who had done this. There was only one person in our lives who moved with such casual violence, who saw the world and the people in it as objects to be arranged for his convenience, and who would see my mother's gentle defiance as a challenge to his authority. David, my husband. The man whose shadow I had lived in for 3 decades. The man who had, until this moment, confined his tyranny to the walls of our home. But now, that shadow had fallen across my mother's face. And in that instant, something dormant and deeply buried within me, something I thought had died years ago, began to stir. It was a cold, hard knot of rage, and it was the first thing in a very long time that had felt entirely my own. "Mama, don't!" I pleaded, my voice cracking. I reached out and gently took her hand, pulling it away from her face, exposing the bruise again to the soft afternoon light. "Don't lie to me. Please." Her eyes, the same warm brown as my own, filled with tears, and in their depths, I saw a reflection of my own 30-year fear. It was a fear so deeply ingrained it was a part of our DNA, a toxic inheritance passed from a daughter who had learned to endure to a mother who was now being taught the same cruel lesson. She was afraid for me, afraid of the storm that would break if this truth was spoken aloud. To her, David was a force of nature, a hurricane to be survived, not confronted. "Annetta, what good would it do?" she whispered, her gaze darting toward the front door as if he might materialize on her doorstep. "It will only make him angrier. It was my fault. I shouldn't have argued with him about the garden. The garden." The whole thing had started over something as simple and pure as her garden. I learned the story in hushed, fragmented pieces. David had come by 2 days ago, unannounced as always, to check on her. This meant inspecting her home for flaws, for signs of weakness, a way to assert his control even here. He had decided her prize-winning rose bushes were blocking the path and needed to be cut back. When she had calmly but firmly refused, telling him she knew how to manage her own garden, he had seen it as an act of rebellion. The argument had escalated. His voice had risen. She had stood her ground, and then a shove. A fall against the edge of the hall table. He hadn't even stayed to see if she was all right. He had simply left, his authority asserted. It wasn't a fall over a rug. It was a punishment for daring to have a will of her own. My own spine stiffened. For 30 years, I had perfected the art of surrender, of having no will because it was the only way to survive. To see that same battle now being fought on my mother's behalf in her own home was an outrage my soul could no longer contain. I left my mother's house an hour later, my mind a raging sea. The drive home, usually a slow 20-minute transition from my sanctuary back to my prison, was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, as a lifetime of suppressed memories flooded the gates. 30 years. How do you explain 30 years of your life evaporating in a fog of fear? It hadn't started this way. I remember David at 25, a man crackling with ambition and a charm that could disarm a whole room. He had swept me off my feet. He was a provider, a protector, a man who promised to give me the world. And he did, in a way. He gave me a beautiful house, a daughter, a life that from the outside looked like a perfect portrait of success. But the frame was gilded, and the canvas was rotting from within. The control had been a slow, insidious creep. It began with little things, pebbles that would eventually become a landslide. My friends, he'd said, were holding me back with their small-town ambitions. My dream of going back to school to study horticulture was a nice hobby, but his career needed my full support. He didn't forbid me from doing things. He just made it impossible. If I had plans to meet a friend for lunch, A crisis would erupt at his office, or he would pick a fight so draining that by the time it was over, I was too exhausted to go. He isolated me so slowly, so masterfully, that I didn't realize I was on an island until I was the only inhabitant. Then came the financial control. I had no money of my own. I was given a weekly allowance for groceries and household expenses, and I had to produce a receipt for every penny spent. I once had to endure a 10-minute lecture on my extravagance for buying a brand name cereal instead of the generic store brand. The humiliation was a constant low-grade fever that slowly burned away my self-worth. I had stayed for our daughter, Sarah. That was the story I told myself, the noble sacrifice I clung to. I would be her shield, her buffer. I would absorb the acid of his moods so that it wouldn't splash onto her. I would swallow my screams so that she could sleep in a quiet house, and in some ways, it worked. Sarah grew up, smart and strong, and escaped to a college 1,000 miles away, blissfully unaware of the true cost of the peace she had enjoyed. With her gone, my last and most cherished excuse was gone with her. I was left alone in the beautiful silent house, with no one to protect but myself, and I had long since decided that I wasn't worth the fight. I pulled into the driveway of that house now and saw it with new, clear eyes. It was perfect. The lawn was manicured. The rose bushes, his rose bushes, were perfectly pruned. The windows gleamed. It was a mausoleum, a beautiful, expensive tomb for the woman I might have been. I walked inside, and the curated silence wrapped around me like a shroud. Every object in this house was a testament to his control. The throw pillows on the sofa were arranged just so. The magazines on the coffee table were fanned out at a precise angle. My own home felt like a museum I was allowed to dust but never to touch. I walked into our bedroom and looked at my reflection in the mirror above the dresser. I saw a woman with tired eyes, her hair neatly coiffed, her tasteful beige dress perfectly pressed. I was another one of his pristine objects, a possession he kept polished and in its place. But for the first time, I saw something else flicker in those eyes. It was the reflection of my mother's bruise, and it was a declaration of war. He had finally overplayed his hand. He had trespassed on holy ground. He had put his mark on the one person in this world I had left to love. I stood there, in the suffocating silence of my perfect prison, and waited for the warden to come home. The minutes ticked by, each one a slow, deliberate beat of a drum counting down to a battle. For the first time in 30 years, I did not prepare for David's arrival. I did not busy myself in the kitchen, orchestrating the precise timing of the roast and vegetables. I did not plump the cushions on the sofa or ensure the lighting was perfectly subdued to soothe his temper after a long day at his law firm. The domestic rituals I had performed daily, acts of appeasement to the angry God who ruled my life, were abandoned. Instead, I did something I had never done. I walked over to the large leather wingback chair that stood sentinel by the fireplace. It was his chair. In all our years in this house, I had never once sat in it. It was his throne, the seat of his power, from which he would issue judgments on the world, on his work, and most often on me. I sank into the cool, worn leather, the material sighing under my weight. The act was a small, silent rebellion, but it felt as significant as planting a flag on conquered territory. I was claiming a piece of my own home, a piece of my own life. From this new vantage point, the house looked different. I could see the subtle layers of control, the invisible tripwires of his expectations. I saw the coasters placed just so, the remote controls for the television aligned in a perfect military row. My entire existence had been a careful navigation of this minefield. A coaster left on the table could trigger a lecture on carelessness. A book left on a chair could spark a tirade about clutter. I had learned to see the world through his eyes, to anticipate his every irritation, my own desires, My own small comforts had been so thoroughly erased that I could no longer remember what they were. As I sat there, a war raged within me. Every conditioned instinct, every cell in my body that had been trained for 3 decades screamed at me to get up. Set the table, check the roast, don't make him angry. You know what happens when he's angry. The voice of fear was a familiar, persuasive serpent whispering of the consequences. It reminded me of his cold, cutting words, the way he could flay you with his disappointment, the chilling silence that could last for days, making you feel like you were suffocating in your own home. But then, the image of my mother's face would flash in my mind, the ugly purple and yellow of the bruise, the shame in her eyes as she tried to cover it. That image was an antidote to the serpent's venom. It was a righteous fire that burned hotter than my fear. This was not about a misplaced coaster or a cluttered room. This was about a line that had been crossed, a violation so profound it had rewritten the entire contract of my life. My fight was no longer just for my own suffocated soul. It was for her, for the woman who had given me life, who had taught me to be strong, a lesson I had long since forgotten. I reached for the small, silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a picture of me and Mama, taken years before I met David. We were standing in her garden, laughing, my arm around her shoulder. I looked at the woman in the photo, the young Annetta with the bright, hopeful eyes, and I felt a surge of protective anger, not just for my mother, but for her, for the girl I had been before the shadow fell. I would not let him erase her too. The sound of his car pulling into the driveway was a gunshot in the quiet house. My heart leaped into my throat, a frantic, panicked thing. The serpent of fear hissed its final warnings. It's not too late. Get up. Smile. Pretend everything is normal. But I remained seated, my hand gripping the cool silver of the picture frame. I listened to the familiar sequence of sounds, but they were alien to me now. The muted roar of the engine cutting off, the solid, authoritative slam of the car door, the jingle of his keys, a sound that used to make my stomach clench in anticipation, the heavy tread of his footsteps on the stone path. These were the sounds of my captor returning to his cage, but tonight the lock on the cage was broken. The front door opened and he walked in. David was a handsome man, even at 55. His silvering hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit immaculate. He exuded an aura of power and control. It was what had drawn me to him, and it was what had eventually crushed me. He went through his evening ritual without even looking at me, so assured was he of the order of his world. He placed his briefcase by the door, hung his keys on the designated hook, and loosened his silk tie. "Annetta?" he called out, his voice echoing in the silent house, expecting me to emerge from the kitchen, an apron on, a drink in my hand. He walked into the living room and stopped dead. He saw me, in his chair, just sitting there watching him. Confusion flickered across his face, quickly followed by irritation. This was a disruption in the program, an error in the code. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice laced with the condescending tone he used when I had done something particularly stupid. "Why isn't dinner ready? Are you just going to sit there all evening?" He looked at me, really looked at me then, and for the first time he must have seen something different in my eyes, something that wasn't fear. He must have seen the reflection of a cold, hard resolve. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. After 30 years of silence, of looking down, of making myself small, I met his gaze. My voice, when it came out, was not the whisper he was used to. It was calm, level, and clear. "David," I said, and in the space of that single quiet word, the entire foundation of our lives began to crack. My husband's name, spoken in that quiet, steady tone, hung in the air between us. It was a sound he was not used to hearing, not from me. For 30 years I had whispered his name, I had called it with feigned cheerfulness, I had choked it back in anger, but I had never spoken it like this. I had never spoken it as his equal. He stood in the archway between the living room and the hall, his hand still on his loosened tie, a portrait of masculine authority momentarily frozen by a glitch in the system. The irritation on his face deepened, his brows knitting together in a dark line. This was not the welcome he expected. This was not the orderly, predictable world he had built for himself. "I asked you a question, Annetta," he said, his voice dropping into the low, menacing register that had always been the prelude to a storm. It was the voice that could make my blood run cold, that could make me shrink and apologize for transgressions I hadn't even committed. "Don't play games with me. Not tonight." But the voice no longer held the same power. The image of my mother's bruised face was a shield, a talisman against his dark magic. I remained seated in his throne, the leather cool and solid beneath me. I did not shrink. I did not look away. "I was at my mother's house this afternoon," I said, my voice as calm and level as the surface of a deep, still lake. "I saw the bruise on her face, David." His reaction was a masterclass in the art of dismissal. He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of contempt, and walked over to the bar in the corner of the room to pour himself a scotch. It was a calculated gesture of indifference, designed to tell me that my concern was trivial, that my words had no weight. "For God's sake," he said, his back to me as he dropped ice cubes into a heavy crystal tumbler. "Your mother is 75 years old. Old people fall. They bruise. Are you really going to turn that into a melodrama?" This was his primary weapon, gaslighting. The insidious trick of making you question your own sanity, your own perception of reality. He had used it on me for years, convincing me that my feelings were irrational, that my unhappiness was a symptom of my own weakness, not a response to his cruelty. "She told me what happened," I continued, my voice unwavering, refusing to take the bait. "She said you were there. She said you argued about her garden." He turned around then, the tumbler in his hand, and leaned against the bar. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes cold and assessing over the rim of the glass. "She was being hysterical," he said smoothly, "stubborn. I was trying to help her, trying to prevent her from tripping over those overgrown bushes, and she became belligerent. She lost her footing. It was her own fault. If she had just listened to reason." It was his second favorite weapon, blame shifting. Nothing was ever his fault. The world was simply full of unreasonable, hysterical people who failed to bend to his superior logic. I watched him, this man I had shared a bed with for more than half my life, and I felt nothing. No love, no fear, just a vast, cold clarity. He was not just a bully. He was a liar, so practiced in his own deceptions that he probably believed them himself. And in that moment, as he saw that his usual tactics were having no effect, that I was not dissolving into apologies or tears, his expression shifted. The mask of irritation and condescension slipped, and for a fleeting, terrible second I saw the truth. A cruel, knowing smirk flickered at the corner of his mouth. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was a smirk of victory. It acknowledged the bruise not as an accident, but as a righteous punishment delivered to a subordinate who had dared to step out of line. It was the silent, arrogant confession of a tyrant who believed in his divine right to rule, to punish, to mark. And it was the single most ugly thing I had ever seen. That smirk severed the final frayed thread that bound me to him. 30 years of swallowed anger, of silent screams, of meticulously curated peace. All of it came to an end in that one vile expression. He had not just hurt my mother. He had enjoyed it. A coldness so profound it felt like ice filled my veins. My fear was gone, burned away by the pure, clean fire of rage. While he was still speaking, still weaving his web of lies about my mother's stubbornness, I reached into the pocket of my dress and pulled out my cell phone. His voice faltered as he saw the small rectangular object in my hand. His eyes narrowed. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, the velvet glove of his condescension finally coming off. I didn't answer him. My fingers, surprisingly steady, moved across the screen. I pressed the 3 numbers I had never dared to press before, 9-1-1. I lifted the phone to my ear just as he started to move toward me, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Annetta, put that phone down," he snarled. But it was too late. A calm, professional voice spoke into my ear. 911? What's your emergency?" And I looked directly into the eyes of my husband of 30 years, the man who thought he had broken me, and I prepared to speak. "Ma'am, are you there? What is your emergency?" The operator's voice was a lifeline, a calm, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of my living room. David was still moving towards me, his face a thunderous mask of rage. For a moment, the old instinctual fear flared and my hand trembled. He was bigger, stronger, and for the first time in our marriage, his anger was untethered, no longer a controlled storm, but a wild, unpredictable force. But then I looked past him, at the pristine, lifeless room he had created, and my resolve hardened. This was not a home. It was a stage set for a one-man show, and I was done playing my part. I took a steadying breath and spoke into the phone, my voice clear and firm, a voice I barely recognized as my own. "Yes, hello. My name is Annetta Miller. I need to report a domestic crime." I chose the words carefully. Not a dispute, not a problem. A crime. My husband has just implicitly confessed to assaulting my 75-year-old mother 2 days ago. I am in the house with him now. He is becoming aggressive. David stopped in his tracks as if he'd hit a wall. The word crime had registered, the legal and social implications exploding in his lawyer's mind. His rage momentarily gave way to a look of pure, panicked disbelief. "Annetta, what in God's name are you doing?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. He was no longer shouting, he was trying to contain the damage, to stop the official record from being created. "You are destroying our family. You are destroying everything. Think about Sarah. Think of our reputation. Hang up this phone right now." In the background, I could hear the operator speaking, asking for our address, her voice a calm counterpoint to my husband's frantic threats. I recited our address, the one that was printed on his expensive letterhead, the one that represented success and stability to the outside world, and in doing so, I felt like I was finally telling the truth about what this place really was. The operator told me officers were on their way and to stay on the line if I could. The few minutes that followed were the longest of my life. David paced the room like a caged panther, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. He alternated between threats and pleas, a dizzying display of his manipulative arsenal. One moment he was telling me I would end up with nothing, that he would ruin me in court. The next, he was reminding me of our wedding, of the life we had built, his voice thick with a false sentimentality that turned my stomach. I said nothing. I just stood there, the phone pressed to my ear, a silent sentinel guarding a boundary he had never known existed. Then we saw it. The strobing pulse of red and blue lights flashing silently against the living room walls, painting his prized possessions, the antique sideboard, the oil paintings, the crystal decanters, in the garish colors of a crime scene. The real world, with its laws and its consequences, had finally arrived at our door. The doorbell rang, a sharp, authoritative chime that shattered the last of our curated silence. I walked to the door and opened it. 2 police officers stood on our perfectly swept porch. One was older, with a weary, seen-it-all expression. The other was younger, a woman, her gaze sharp and observant. As I stepped aside to let them in, I saw David transform. It was a stunning, terrifying performance. The enraged, panicked man vanished in an instant. In his place stood David Miller, Esquire, a pillar of the community, a concerned, rational husband dealing with a difficult situation. He met them in the foyer, his hand extended, a look of grave concern on his face. "Officers, thank God you're here," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Please come in." "I'm so sorry you were called out here. My wife, she's been going through a difficult time lately. Very emotional. Menopause, perhaps. She's gotten a hold of a rather fantastic notion and she's become quite hysterical." He gestured towards me, not with anger, but with a look of profound, pitying sadness, as if I were a sick child to be managed. It was a brilliant, devastating move. In a few short sentences, he had framed the entire narrative. He was the calm, stable center, and I was the unhinged, hormonal woman. I felt the old, familiar shame wash over me. The 30 years of conditioning that told me my feelings were invalid, my reality mistaken. I saw the older officer's expression soften with a sort of weary sympathy for my husband, but the younger officer, Officer Riley, was watching me. Her eyes didn't hold pity, they held a quiet, steady focus. "Ma'am," she said, her voice respectful, cutting through David's smooth monologue, "can you tell me in your own words what happened?" I opened my mouth, but for a moment, the words wouldn't come. My throat was tight, choked with a lifetime of unshed tears and unspoken truths. David started to speak for me. As I was saying, she's convinced that But Officer Riley held up a hand. "Sir, I'd like to hear from her, please." She took a small step towards me, creating a subtle, protective space between me and my husband. That small gesture gave me the strength I needed. I found my voice. I told them about the bruise, about my mother's lie, about David's smirk. The older officer still looked skeptical. "So, you didn't actually see him do anything?" he asked. "This is all based on a feeling you got?" "We'll need to speak with the alleged victim to verify the claim," Officer Riley stated, her gaze still on me. "We need to see the bruise for ourselves." The moment had come. The next, and perhaps highest, hurdle. I had to call my mother, to drag her from the fragile safety of her silence and ask her to stand with me against the man she feared more than anyone. I nodded, my heart heavy with what I was about to ask of her. I dialed her number, my hands trembling again. David stood across the room, his arms crossed, a look of smug certainty on his face. He knew my mother. He knew how deep her fear ran. He believed he was about to win. The phone rang twice, and then her small, frightened voice came on the line. "Hello?" "Mama," I said, trying to inject a strength I didn't feel into my voice. "It's Annetta. I have some police officers here with me. They need to talk to you about what happened." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by a panicked whisper. "Annetta, numero." "Please, just tell them it was a mistake. Don't do this. You're only going to make it worse." My mother's panicked whisper on the other end of the line was the sound of 30 years of my own fear, echoed back at me. David's smirk widened. He had been so certain of his power, so sure that the web of fear he had spun around our family was unbreakable. He believed he was watching me fail, watching my pathetic little rebellion crumble under the weight of my mother's terror. For a heartbreaking second, I almost gave in. The path of least resistance was a well-worn groove in my soul, and the urge to retreat, to apologize, to smooth everything over was immense. The thought of causing my mother more pain, more fear, was a physical agony. But then I looked at David's smug, triumphant face, and I knew that surrendering now would be the greater cruelty. To retreat would be to condemn my mother and myself to a future of the same silent, creeping violence. It would be teaching her the lesson he had taught me, that her safety, her dignity did not matter. I took a deep breath, my knuckles white on the phone, and found a strength I never knew I possessed. It was a strength born not for myself, but for her. "Mama," I said, my voice low and fierce, infused with the love that was more powerful than my fear. "I hear you. I know you're scared. I've been scared my whole life, but that ends tonight. He hurt you. He put his hands on you, and that is not okay. I am not going to let him hurt you or me ever again. I need you to be brave with me, Mama. Just for a few minutes. I can't do this alone." There was a sob on the other end of the line, a sound of a heart breaking and a will being forged all at once. Before my mother could respond, Officer Riley, who had heard my plea, stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said, motioning for the phone. "May I?" I handed it to her. Her voice when she spoke to my mother was a perfect blend of gentle authority and profound empathy. "Ma'am, this is Officer Riley with the city police. I understand you're frightened and I am so sorry for what you've been through. My partner and I just need to come by to make sure you're safe and take a statement about what happened. We're not here to cause any more trouble, I promise. We're just here to do our job and help you. We're on our way now." She listened for a moment, then said, "We'll see you in a few minutes," and ended the call. She had taken the decision out of my mother's hands, lifting the burden of responsibility from her fragile shoulders. "Okay," she said, turning to her partner. "Let's do this. I'll go to the mother's residence. You stay here with Mr. and Mrs. Miller. David's face had gone rigid, his smirk vanishing as his control of the situation evaporated completely. He was no longer dealing with his hysterical wife. He was dealing with the calm, procedural machinery of the law. As Officer Riley left, a tense, suffocating silence descended upon the living room. It was just me, David, and the older, weary-looking officer who now watched my husband with a new professional suspicion. David, ever the performer, tried to regain his footing. He sat in one of the pristine armchairs, crossed his legs, and adopted the air of a man being unjustly persecuted. He spoke to the officer about the difficulties of caring for the elderly, the emotional toll on a family, all while casting me as the unstable catalyst. I ignored him. I walked to the window and watched the flashing lights of the second patrol car as it drove away into the night, carrying the hope of my future with it. The scene at my mother's house, as I would learn later, was quiet and gentle. Officer Riley found my mother sitting in her armchair, her hands trembling in her lap. The officer didn't launch into an interrogation. She commented on the beautiful quilt on the back of the chair. She asked about the photographs on the mantelpiece. She created a small island of safety in my mother's sea of fear. And then, gently, she said, "Ma'am, I just need you to tell me what happened with the bruise on your cheek." And my mother, looking into the eyes of this kind, strong young woman who was there only to help, finally let her own courage surface. The dam of her fear broke, and the truth came out in a flood of tears. She told the officer about the garden, about David's anger, about the shove and the hard edge of the table. Her quiet, tearful confession was more powerful than any shouted accusation. It was the simple, undeniable truth. Back in my living room, the officer's radio crackled to life. He listened for a moment, his expression unreadable, then he stood up. His demeanor had changed. He was no longer a passive observer. He was an agent of the law. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice flat and official, "I've just spoken with my partner. Based on the victim's corroborating statement, we are filing a report for assault. An emergency protective order will be put in place, effective immediately. For the safety of everyone involved, I need you to pack a bag with whatever you need for the night. You will have to leave the premises." The color drained from David's face. The mask of composure shattered, revealing the impotent, sputtering rage of a king who had just been dethroned in his own throne room. "This is absurd," he roared, shooting to his feet. "You can't be serious. I am a respected attorney." "I will have your badge for this. This is my house." "Sir," the officer said, his voice calm but unyielding, his hand resting lightly on his belt, "you can take that up with the judge. Right now, you are leaving. It's your choice whether you leave on your own 2 feet or in the back of my car." The threat was clear. David, for all his bluster, was a lawyer. He knew a losing battle when he saw one. He stared at me, his eyes promising a retribution so severe I could almost feel it. "You have no idea what you've just done," he spat. Then he turned and stormed up the stairs. A few minutes later, he came back down with an overnight bag, his movements jerky and violent. He stalked to the front door without another word, a man consumed by a fury he could not unleash. I watched as he walked out of the house, out of my life. The officer gave me a nod. "We'll have a car parked on the street for the rest of the night just in case. A detective from the domestic violence unit will be in touch tomorrow." And then he too was gone. The front door clicked shut. The flashing lights disappeared. And there was silence. But it was a silence I had never heard before. It wasn't the tense, curated quiet of David's presence. It was vast, empty, deep, and clean. I stood in the middle of my living room, my perfect prison, and took a breath. It was the first free breath I had taken in 30 years. The battle was over. But as the terrifying, exhilarating reality of what I had done began to settle in, I knew the war for my life, for my soul, had only just begun. I woke the next morning to a silence that was so absolute, so alien, it felt like I had gone deaf. For a dizzying moment, the old dread clenched my stomach. I was late. David would be angry. I had to get up, get the coffee started, begin the delicate daily dance of managing his mood. Then, memory returned in a tidal wave. The bruise, the 911 call, the flashing lights, the final satisfying click of the front door closing behind him. He was gone. I was alone. The dread did not vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer the familiar, suffocating fear of a man's anger, but the vast, terrifying, exhilarating fear of the unknown. I lay in the center of our large marital bed, a bed I had never truly felt was my own, and stared at the empty space beside me. I had won the first battle, but now, in the stark, unforgiving light of morning, the full scope of the war ahead began to reveal itself. The first volley was fired at precisely 8:15 a.m. The phone rang, and I picked it up, my hand trembling slightly. It was a woman's voice, calm and professional. Detective Murphy from the Domestic Violence Unit. She was kind but direct, her questions a methodical unpacking of the previous night's trauma. She informed me of the next steps. I needed to come to the station to give a formal videotaped statement. She explained the process of filing for a temporary restraining order, a TRO, and the labyrinth of paperwork that would follow. Each word she spoke, statement, petition, hearing, was a brick in the new reality I was building. This was no longer just a family drama contained within the pristine walls of my home. It was a case file, a legal proceeding. The thought was both terrifying and validating. My private pain was finally being given a public name. The second call, an hour later, was the one that nearly broke me. It was my daughter, Sarah, her voice high and tight with panic and confusion. "Mom, what is going on? I just got off the phone with Dad. He said you had him arrested. He said you had some kind of breakdown. Is he okay? Are you okay?" David had wasted no time. He had launched his counteroffensive, using our own daughter as his first and most powerful weapon. He had spun his narrative, painting himself as the victim of my irrational, menopausal hysteria. It was the same story he had tried to sell the police, but it was far more devastating coming from the mouth of my child. "Sarah, honey, it's not like that," I began, my voice thick with tears I had refused to shed the night before. How could I possibly explain 30 years of slow-burning, soul-crushing abuse in a single phone call? How could I make her see the monster that had always hidden behind the mask of a perfect, doting father? I tried. I spoke of the bruise on her grandmother's face, of his smirk, of the cold, calculated cruelty I had finally found the strength to confront. But my words had to fight against a lifetime of her own experiences, a childhood carefully curated to shield her from that reality. But Dad would never do that, she said, her confusion turning to a defensive disbelief. He's never laid a hand on you. He's always been a good father to me. Her words were a knife in my heart, not because they were cruel, but because they were the exact result I had engineered. I had protected her so well, had absorbed so much of his poison that she had no antibodies to it. She couldn't see the sickness because I had been the only one to show the symptoms. I ended the call feeling more alone than I had when David was in the house. The one person I had sacrificed my life for was now a pawn in his game. Her love and loyalty weaponized against me. I drove to my mother's house in a daze, the weight of my daughter's doubt a physical burden. I found Mama in the kitchen, her face pale, but her eyes filled with a new fierce light. She had been terrified last night, a rabbit caught in the headlights. But the morning had brought clarity. She had seen the cost of her fear in my tears, in my broken voice on the phone. He called her, didn't he? She said, her voice tight with an anger I had never heard from her before. I just nodded, sinking into a kitchen chair. She came and stood behind me, her small, wrinkled hands resting on my shoulders. They were the same hands that had bandaged my scraped knees as a child, that had held me when my heart was broken for the first time. They were hands that knew how to heal. He has been poisoning this family for 30 years, Annetta, she said, her voice a steel rod of certainty. He poisoned you, and now he is trying to poison your daughter against you. We will not let him. I will talk to her. I will tell her everything. You did the right thing. And we will see this through together. In her strength, I found my own. My daughter's doubt had been a devastating blow, but my mother's faith was the shield that would allow me to stand back up. We were two women, a generation apart, who had both been terrorized by the same man, but we were no longer his victims. We were survivors, and our war had just begun. The days that followed were a crash course in the brutal mechanics of dismantling a life. My first official step was giving my formal statement at the police station. I sat in a small, cold, windowless room, a video camera mounted in the corner like a silent, unblinking eye. Detective Murphy was professional and patient, but the act of translating 30 years of subtle, creeping terror into a language the law could understand felt like trying to describe the color of the wind. How do you quantify the weight of a dismissive glance? The slow-acting poison of a condescending tone, the 1,000 tiny humiliations that had eroded my soul to sand. I spoke of the tangible things, the financial control, the isolation from my friends, and finally, the hard, undeniable fact of the bruise on my mother's face. I left the station feeling hollowed out, as if I had exhumed my own life for a stranger's inspection. The temporary restraining order was granted the next day, a flimsy piece of paper that felt like a shield made of cobwebs against a man like David. The order meant he couldn't contact me, couldn't come within 100 yards of the house or my mother. It was a small, crucial victory, a legal acknowledgement that my fear was valid. I allowed myself a fleeting moment of relief, a single deep breath in the quiet of my house. That relief was shattered less than 24 hours later at the checkout line of the grocery store. I had filled a cart with essentials for myself and my mother, and when I went to pay, the cashier informed me, with a look of pity, that my card had been declined. I tried another, a joint credit card we had used for 20 years. Declined, she said again. A cold, sick feeling washed over me. I left the full cart under the fluorescent lights and walked out of the store, my face burning with a humiliation so profound it was dizzying. I sat in my car and called the bank. The customer service representative was polite but firm. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller, but your husband, as the primary account holder, has frozen all assets in your joint accounts pending a legal review. All supplementary credit cards have also been canceled." I hung up the phone, the world dissolving into a blurry haze. Of all his cruelties, this one was perhaps the most brutally effective. He had not needed to shout or threaten. With a few quiet phone calls, he had cut me off at the knees. I had no job, no savings of my own, not a single dollar to my name. I was a 52-year-old woman with a beautiful house I couldn't afford, a car I couldn't put gas in, and a refrigerator that was nearly empty. His message was clear. "You think you can survive without me? Try." My mother's small pension was a lifeline, but it was barely enough to keep her own lights on, let alone fund a legal war against a man who could afford a whole army of lawyers. For a day, I was paralyzed by a panic so complete it felt like I was drowning. David had been right. I was nothing without him. But then the memory of his smirk, the feel of my mother's hand in mine, the quiet strength in Detective Murphy's voice, these things were a life raft. I would not drown. I called the detective, my voice shaking, and explained what had happened. She was not surprised. "It's a classic move," she said, her voice tight with anger on my behalf. "It's called legal and financial abuse, and it's designed to make you give up and go back. But you're not going to do that." She gave me a number for the County Legal Aid Society, specifically for their domestic violence division. The next day, I walked into an office that was the polar opposite of David's gleaming, mahogany-paneled law firm. The furniture was worn, the coffee was burnt, but the air was filled with a quiet, determined energy. My lawyer was a woman in her 60s named Carol, her face a roadmap of tough battles fought and won, her eyes sharp and missing nothing. I told her my story, expecting the same skepticism I had seen on the face of the first police officer. Instead, she just nodded, occasionally interjecting with a question. When I got to the part about the canceled credit cards, she sighed. "Of course he did," she said as if commenting on the weather. The Abuser's Playbook, Chapter 1. For the first time, I felt truly seen. She didn't just hear my story, she understood its language, its syntax, its hidden grammar of control. She explained that she would take my case pro bono and immediately file an emergency motion to force David to release funds for my living expenses. "I have one condition, though," Carol said, leaning forward. "The legal battle is only half of it. The other half is you. David isolated you for 30 years. Your healing begins with ending that isolation. I want you to attend the support group for domestic abuse survivors. They meet here every Wednesday night." I recoiled at the thought. To speak of my private shame in a room full of strangers felt like an impossible task, but I saw the non-negotiable look in Carol's eyes and agreed. That Wednesday, I walked into a meeting room in the basement of the building, my heart pounding. The room was filled with about a dozen women of all ages, races, and walks of life. A quiet woman started to speak, her voice trembling, and she told a story of her husband's gaslighting that was so similar to my own, I felt the air leave my lungs. Another woman spoke of her ex-partner's financial abuse. Another spoke of the terror of leaving, another of the struggle with her children. As I listened, a profound, earth-shattering realization dawned on me. I was not alone. My story was not my own unique shame. It was a pattern, a textbook, a shared and brutal experience that connected every woman in that room. The isolation David had so carefully constructed around me was an illusion. In this small, humble basement, I had found my tribe. The fragile peace I had begun to build in the sanctuary of my support group was shattered by the return of my daughter. Sarah came home from college a week later, not for a holiday, but on a mission. She was an inquisitor, determined to get to the bottom of the mess that had scandalized her perfect, well-ordered life. The reunion at my mother's house, where I was now staying, was painfully strained. She hugged me, But it was a stiff, obligatory gesture, a world away from the warm embraces we used to share. She had been talking to David every day, and his voice was echoing in her questions, his narrative woven into the fabric of her confusion. "I just don't understand, Mom," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where my mother had nursed her own bruise. "Dad is a wreck. He says he misses you, that he doesn't know what he did wrong. Why couldn't you just try talking to him? Why did you have to call the police and blow everything up like this? You've embarrassed the whole family." Each question was a fresh wound. I was on trial, and my own daughter was the prosecuting attorney. I tried to explain, to bridge the chasm between the father she knew, the one who bought her first car and applauded the loudest at her graduation, and the tyrant I knew. I spoke of the invisible walls of his control, the constant low-level fear, the slow erosion of my soul. But my words were abstract, ethereal, while her father's narrative was simple and compelling. Her mother was unstable, and he was the victim. It was my own mother who finally broke through. That evening, after a tense, miserable dinner, Martha asked to speak with Sarah alone. I sat in the living room, my hands clenched in my lap, listening to the low murmur of their voices from the kitchen. Mama didn't speak with anger. She spoke with the quiet, undeniable authority of a witness. She told Sarah stories from the past, small things, anecdotes that, when viewed alone, meant nothing, but when woven together, created a chilling tapestry of control. She spoke of how David had insisted I quit the church choir because their evening practices interfered with his dinner schedule. She reminded Sarah of the time her high school friends had come over and David had been so icily polite that they had never come back. And then she spoke of the bruise. "Your father is a good provider, Sarah," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But a man's goodness is not measured by the size of the house he gives you. It is measured by the size of the world he allows you to live in. And for 30 years, your father made your mother's world smaller and smaller until it was only the size of his shadow. The mark on my face was just the first time that shadow fell where you could see it." Her words planted a seed of doubt, but it was David himself who watered it. The next day, Sarah went to see him at the expensive hotel where he was staying. She went wanting to believe him, wanting to restore the comfortable order of her world. As she told me later, the first hour was a masterful performance. He was heartbroken, confused, concerned only for my well-being. But then his mask slipped. Sarah, now armed with her grandmother's perspective, began to ask more pointed questions. She asked about the canceled credit cards. "Your mother needs to learn the value of $1. He'd snapped, his voice turning cold. "She needs to understand that her actions have consequences." Then Sarah asked about my dream of studying horticulture. It was a silly, childish fantasy, he'd scoffed. She had a far more important job, supporting me and raising you. The true moment of revelation, however, came by accident. While Sarah was there, David took a call from his lead attorney. He walked into the other room of the hotel suite, but he didn't close the door all the way. Sarah heard him. His voice was no longer that of the heartbroken husband. It was the cold, calculating voice of David Miller, Esquire. "We're going to bury her," he'd said to his lawyer, his voice dripping with venom. "Drag it out, drown her in paperwork. By the time this is over, she won't have a penny to her name. She'll come crawling back, begging." In that one overheard sentence, Sarah finally heard the man I had been describing. The mask was gone, and the monster was in plain sight. She came back to my mother's house that evening, her face pale, her eyes filled with a dawning horror and a profound, bottomless grief for the father she thought she knew. She walked into the living room where I was sitting and simply fell into my arms, her body shaking with sobs. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she wept. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see. I never saw." I held her. my own tears mixing with hers, and felt the final broken piece of my heart begin to mend. The chasm between us was closed. My daughter was home. That night, for the first time in months, we were a family again. Not the perfect, hollow family from the Christmas cards, but a real one. A trinity of women, a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter, united by a shared truth and a shared resolve. Sarah became my fiercest advocate, my most organized ally. She helped me sort through the mountains of legal paperwork, her sharp, young mind cutting through the jargon that had so intimidated me. With my mother, my daughter, my lawyer, and my sisters in the support group, I was no longer an island. I was the heart of a small, powerful army. A few weeks later, the date for the final hearing for the permanent restraining order and the initial divorce settlement was set. I looked at the official court summons, at David's name printed opposite mine. A year ago, this piece of paper would have sent me into a spiral of terror. Now, I laid it on the table and placed my hand over it, feeling the crisp, solid weight of the paper beneath my palm. It was not a threat. It was a promise. The promise of a final, legal, and absolute emancipation. The morning of the court hearing dawned gray and heavy, the sky the color of slate. I stood before the mirror in my mother's small guest bedroom, a stranger looking back at me. 6 months ago, the woman in this mirror would have been dressed in a shade of beige, her expression carefully neutral, her spirit camouflaged to avoid attracting attention. But the woman who stared back at me today was different. I was dressed in a simple dark blue dress, a color of quiet strength my lawyer Carol had recommended. My eyes, though shadowed with the fatigue of the long battle, held a new light, a steady, unwavering resolve. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach, but it no longer owned me. It was just a passenger now, and I was the one driving. 30 years of tyranny had led to this single day, this single room where the truth would finally be given a voice. I was not going alone. When I walked into the kitchen, my mother and Sarah were waiting for me. They were my generals, my trusted guards, my army. My mother, dressed in her Sunday best, handed me a cup of hot coffee, her hand steady on mine. "Whatever happens today, Annetta," she said, her voice firm, "you have already won. You are free." Sarah came and wrapped her arms around my shoulders from behind, her embrace strong and sure. "We've got your back, Mom," she whispered, "every step of the way." In their faces, I saw my own strength reflected back at me. We were the 3 generations of women David had tried to control, to divide, to conquer. And here we stood, a united, unbreakable front. The courthouse was just as I had imagined it, a cold, imposing cathedral of power, all marble floors and echoing hallways, designed to make the individual feel small and insignificant. This was David's world. He understood its language of power, its rituals of intimidation. As we waited in the corridor outside the designated courtroom, I felt a tremor of the old fear. I was an outsider here, an amateur about to face a professional in his own arena. And then I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the hall with his lawyer, a man in a suit even more expensive than his own. David was laughing, projecting an aura of effortless confidence. The king holding court. He looked rested, powerful, utterly unconcerned. This was just another Tuesday for him, another case to be won, another lesser being to be crushed. He saw us. The laughter died on his lips, and his eyes, cold and gray as the morning sky, found mine. For a moment I saw a flicker of surprise in them, as if he hadn't truly expected me to see this through to the end. He excused himself from his lawyer and began walking towards us. It was a power move, a final preemptive strike designed to intimidate and unnerve me before the hearing even began. My mother and daughter instinctively moved closer, flanking me, a silent, protective wall. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed solely on me, dismissing the other two as if they were pieces of furniture. "Annetta," he said, his voice a low, confidential murmur laced with a tone of feigned concern that had once been so effective. "It is not too late to stop this foolishness. Think about what you're doing. Think about everything you are throwing away. You can walk away from this right now. If you don't, I promise you, you will leave this building with absolutely nothing." The threat was clear, the final offer from the warden to his errant prisoner. Come back to your cell and your punishment will be lenient. The Annetta of 6 months ago would have trembled. She would have looked at the floor, her spirit wilting under the heat of his condescension. But he wasn't speaking to her anymore. I looked up, my spine straight, and met the gaze of the man who had stolen 30 years of my life, and I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated freedom. "I'm not the one who's going to walk away with nothing, David," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the echoing halls. "You already have nothing." I glanced at my mother, at my daughter, the 2 people who loved me, the 2 people I would die for. Then I looked back at him, at his expensive suit and his empty eyes. "You're all alone." I saw the flicker of shock in his eyes, the momentary crack in his armor of arrogance. He had lost his power over me, and he knew it. The inside of the courtroom was even colder than the hallway. The dark wood paneling seemed to absorb all the light and sound, creating a formal, somber silence that was broken only by the rustle of papers and the clerk's monotone voice. We sat on a hard wooden bench, me, my mother, and Sarah, a small island of quiet solidarity. Across the aisle sat David and his lawyer. My husband looked perfectly at ease, whispering confidently to his counsel, the picture of a man unjustly accused but certain of his vindication. This room, with its rigid rules and hierarchies of power, was his natural habitat. I, on the other hand, felt like a foreign species, a creature of silence and shadows suddenly thrust under the harsh fluorescent lights of public scrutiny. The judge entered, a woman in her late 50s named Marion Fields, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that instantly cut through the room's tension. She took her seat, surveyed the courtroom, and the proceedings began. David's case went first, and it was a brutal, characteristically masterful performance of distortion. His lawyer, a sleek, silver-haired man named Mr. Davies, was an artist of insinuation. He painted a portrait of my husband as a generous, long-suffering man who had provided a life of luxury for a wife who had grown increasingly ungrateful and unstable. He spoke of my erratic behavior in recent months. He twisted my 30 years as a homemaker into a narrative of idleness. He presented the 911 call not as a desperate plea for help, but as a calculated act of domestic terrorism designed to humiliate a successful man. I had to sit there, my hands clenched in my lap, and listen to the story of my life being rewritten into a vicious fiction. Every sacrifice I had made for my family was painted as a sign of my weakness, every act of survival a symptom of my instability. David sat at his table, a look of profound, sorrowful concern on his face, occasionally shaking his head as if in pity for my tragic delusion. It was a suffocating, poisonous performance, and I could feel the old familiar tendrils of self-doubt trying to snake their way back into my heart. I squeezed my daughter's hand, and she squeezed back, a silent transfer of strength that kept me anchored. Then it was my turn. "The petitioner calls Annetta Miller to the stand," Carol said, her voice calm and clear. The long walk from the bench to the witness stand felt like a mile. Every eye in the room was on me. I could feel David's gaze on my back, cold and heavy. I sat down, my hands trembling slightly as I was sworn in. Carol approached, her expression a comforting mixture of kindness and steel. She began gently, asking me to state my name, my age, the length of my marriage. Then she led me through the last 30 years. Guided by her calm, precise questions, I found my voice. I did not shout. I did not cry. I spoke with a quiet, steady dignity that felt entirely new. I told the court about the weekly grocery allowance and the mandatory receipts. I told them how my friends had slowly disappeared from my life. I described the suffocating silence of my beautiful, empty house. I was not just telling a story of my own unhappiness. I was laying out a clear, undeniable pattern of coercive control, a term Carol had taught me. I was giving a name to the nameless horror I had endured. Then Carol brought me to the day I saw my mother. "And what did you see when you visited your mother, Mrs. Miller?" she asked. I took a breath. "I saw a bruise on her face," I said, my voice catching for the first time. A deep, ugly bruise just below her cheekbone. I described my husband's reaction when I confronted him. The casual dismissal, the blame shifting, and finally, the small, cruel smirk that had broken my silence forever. When it was Mr. Davies' turn to cross-examine me, he approached the stand like a predator circling its prey. His voice was slick with condescending pity. "Mrs. Miller," he began a tragic story. "But let's be clear on a few facts. For 30 years, your husband, my client, provided you with a life many women would envy. Correct? A beautiful home, financial security, a daughter who went to a top university. He provided a beautiful cage," I said, my voice quiet but firm. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "And in all those 30 years," he continued, his voice dripping with theatrical skepticism, "did your husband ever once strike you? Did he ever physically harm you in any way?" "No," I admitted. "No," he repeated, turning to the judge as if to say, "See, no physical violence. So, I ask you, Mrs. Miller, why now? Why this sudden public melodrama after 3 decades of what was, by your own admission, a peaceful and prosperous marriage? Why are you suddenly claiming to be a victim?" This was the moment, the question designed to invalidate my entire existence, to frame me as a liar and an opportunist. I took a deep breath. I did not look at him. I did not look at David. I looked directly at Judge Fields, woman to woman. "You are correct, sir," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even me. "He never hit me. A bruise on the skin heals. David is far more methodical than that. He spent 30 years trying to leave a bruise on my soul. He spent 30 years trying to erase me, to make me so small and so silent that I would forget I even existed. And he almost succeeded." I leaned forward slightly, my hands gripping the edge of the witness box. But a person is not a possession to be polished and put on a shelf for display. A person is a mother. A person is a daughter. The bruise on my mother's face, that was his one mistake. It was a mirror. And in it, I finally saw myself. He didn't just assault an elderly woman that day. He assaulted my past and he assaulted my future. He assaulted my family. And you cannot erase a family. I am here today, not because I am a victim who wants pity. I am here because I am a daughter. And I am a mother. And I will not be erased. A profound silence fell over the courtroom. It was the sound of a truth so fundamental it needed no further argument. I saw a flicker of something in Judge Fields' eyes. Not pity, but understanding. In that moment, I knew I had been heard. The silence that followed my testimony was absolute. It was not an empty silence, but a heavy, weighted one filled with the gravity of the truth I had finally spoken aloud. David's lawyer, Mr. Davies, stood frozen for a moment, his planned attacks, his condescending questions now useless. My words had rendered his entire strategy obsolete. He had come prepared to fight a hysterical woman demanding money. He had not come prepared to fight a daughter defending her family's soul. He looked at the judge, at the unwavering expression on her face, and seemed to shrink before my eyes. "I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor," he stammered, and retreated to his table, his swagger gone, replaced by the quiet posture of defeat. Judge Fields made a few notes on the papers in front of her, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. She took off her reading glasses and looked down from her bench, her gaze bypassing the lawyers and landing squarely on David. For the first time all day, I saw my husband flinch. He was no longer the confident king in his courtroom. He was a defendant under the scrutinizing gaze of a higher authority. "Mr. Miller," the judge began, her voice cold and sharp as breaking ice, "I have heard the testimony presented today. I have reviewed the police report from the night of the incident and the statement from the victim of the assault, Mrs. Martha Covington. While this hearing is for a civil restraining order, the picture painted is one of a clear, disturbing, and long-standing pattern of coercive control, intimidation, and psychological abuse. Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling the facade of respectability David had spent his life constructing. The act of violence against your elderly mother-in-law appears to be not an aberration, but the inevitable, physical manifestation of the tyranny you seem to believe is your right as a husband and as a man. Therefore, the court grants the petitioner's request for a permanent restraining order, effective immediately and for the maximum allowable term of 5 years. A collective, quiet gasp came from our side of the aisle. It was more than I had dared to hope for. But the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, her eyes still locked on David, "the court notes your punitive and transparently malicious actions regarding the marital finances. Freezing a spouse of 30 years out of all joint assets is not the act of a concerned husband. It is the act of a bully. The court hereby orders all joint accounts to be unfrozen immediately. Given that the petitioner has no independent income, a fact directly resulting from her 30 years of unpaid domestic labor in support of your career, the court also grants the petitioner temporary exclusive use and possession of the marital home." David's head snapped up, a look of pure, unadulterated shock on his face. "Your Honor," Mr. Davies began, rising to his feet. "Sit down, Mr. Davies," the judge snapped without looking at him. "Your client can reside in one of his other properties. Finally, a temporary alimony of a significant sum will be awarded to Mrs. Miller, effective immediately. Let me be clear, Mr. Miller. This court believes that a woman's 30-year contribution to a family and a career, even without a paycheck, has immense value. That value will be given its proper and considerable weight in the final divorce settlement." She banged her gavel, the sound a sharp, definitive crack that echoed the breaking of my chains. "We are adjourned. It was over." In the space of 5 minutes, my entire world and his had been irrevocably altered. I looked at David. The mask of the powerful attorney, the charming husband, the pillar of the community had been incinerated. All that was left was the raw, ugly face of a petty tyrant who had just been publicly stripped of his power. His face was pale, his hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table, and in his eyes was a look of pure, impotent fury. He had lost. In his arena, by his rules, he had been utterly and completely defeated. Carol leaned over and squeezed my shoulder. "You did it, Annetta," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I felt Sarah's arm wrap around me, and my mother's hand found mine. We stood up, a single united entity. As we walked past David's table, he refused to look at me, his gaze fixed on the wall, a man consumed by a rage he could not unleash. The long walk out of the courtroom was the mirror image of my walk to the witness stand. I was no longer a petitioner, a victim, an accuser. I was a free woman, We pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse and stepped out onto the wide marble steps into the afternoon sun. The gray, overcast morning had broken, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The light was so bright it made me blink. And in that moment, standing in the warmth of the sun, the full, crushing weight of the last 30 years and the immense, soaring lightness of my newfound freedom collided within me. The dam of my composure, which I had held together with sheer will for months, finally broke. A sob deep and raw tore its way from my chest. It was a sound of grief for the woman I had lost, for the years that had been stolen, but it was also a sound of triumph, of release, of a joy so profound it was painful. Sarah and my mother wrapped their arms around me, and we stood there on the steps of the courthouse, a fortress of three, holding each other up. We cried together, our tears mingling, tears of pain, tears of anger, and finally, tears of pure, cleansing, and beautiful relief. The war was over, and we had won. The first few months after the court hearing were a strange and disorienting time. I was a deep-sea diver, slowly, carefully, ascending from the crushing pressure of the depths. I had to learn how to breathe again in the normal atmosphere of a life without fear. I moved back into the house, my house now, and for the first week I walked its silent halls like a ghost. The silence was a new language I had to learn. For 30 years, silence had been a weapon, a tense, simmering void that preceded an explosion. Now it was just quiet. It was the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the chirping of birds outside the window, the rustle of my own movements. It was the sound of peace, and it was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. Slowly, painstakingly, I began the work of exorcising David's ghost from the home we had shared. It was an act of reclamation. The imposing dark leather armchair, his throne, was the first thing to go. I hired 2 young men who hauled it out to the curb like the piece of oppressive furniture it was. In its place, I put a comfortable reading chair covered in a bright floral chintz, and next to it, a small table for a lamp and a stack of books. I painted the living room walls a warm, buttery yellow, a color David would have called gaudy. I filled the house with plants, with life, with color. Each change was a small declaration of independence, a brushstroke in the new portrait of my life. The most important reclamation project, however, was outside. The garden, which David had controlled with an iron fist, became my sanctuary. I ripped out the rigid, formal rose bushes he had prized and planted a chaotic, joyful riot of wildflowers, of sprawling gardenias and fragrant lavender. I spent hours on my knees in the dirt, my hands covered in soil, feeling the sun on my back. I was not just tending to a garden, I was cultivating my own resilience, nurturing the parts of myself that had been forced to lie dormant for 3 decades. My family, the small, powerful army that had seen me through the war, was the bedrock of my new world. Sarah, who had postponed her return to college for a semester, was my constant companion. We healed the fractured parts of our relationship with long talks, with shared meals, with the easy laughter that had been absent from our lives for so long. She saw me not just as her mother, but as a woman, a survivor, and the respect in her eyes was a gift more precious than any alimony check. My mother, Martha, was transformed. Freed from the shadow of David's intimidation, the steel in her spine returned. She was no longer a frightened woman hiding a bruise. She was the matriarch, her wisdom and her unwavering love a constant source of strength. We were a house of women, a house of healing, a house of quiet, unbreakable strength. Life was not easy. Money, even with the court-ordered support, was tight. I had to learn to budget, to manage my own finances, a skill David had deliberately kept from me. There were nights I lay awake, a jolt of panic seizing me as the weight of my new responsibilities threatened to overwhelm me. But then I would remember the alternative. I would remember the silence of waiting for his key in the door, the slow drip poison of his contempt. And I would choose this new, difficult freedom every time. It was at the local garden center, my new favorite place on earth, that I first met Michael. He was the owner, a man in his late 50s with kind, crinkling eyes and hands that were as stained with dirt as my own. I had seen him there a dozen times, and we had always exchanged a polite, friendly nod. One afternoon, I was struggling to load a heavy bag of mulch into my car when he came over. "Here, let me give you a hand with that," he said, his voice warm and gentle. He lifted the bag with an easy strength, and then he smiled. It was a simple, genuine smile with no agenda, no hidden meaning. It was just kind. We started talking about plants at first, about the stubbornness of aphids and the joy of a new bloom. The conversation was easy, comfortable. He was a widower, his wife having passed a few years prior. He spoke of her with a deep and abiding affection that made my heart ache. This was a man who knew how to love a woman, not how to own one. He was the opposite of David in every conceivable way. He was quiet where David was loud. He was gentle where David was hard. He listened more than he spoke. I left the garden center that day with my mulch and with the unfamiliar, tentative fluttering of a new possibility in my chest. The friendship that grew between Michael and me was like a slow, patient sunrise after a 30-year night. There was no sudden, blinding passion. There was only a gentle, steady increase of light and warmth. Our courtship, if you could call it that, took place among the petunias and tomato plants. He would set aside a special type of fertilizer for me at the garden center, or I would bring him a jar of my mother's famous peach preserves. Our conversations flowed easily, two rivers that had finally found their way to the same calm sea. We spoke of simple things. The weather, our children, the best way to support a climbing rose. He never asked about my past, and I never offered. The unspoken boundary was a space of respect, an acknowledgement that I was a woman with a history, and he was a man patient enough to let me be the one to tell it, if and when I was ready. The first time I invited him to the house, it felt like a monumental step. It was not for a date, but for a task. My mother's favorite armchair, the one she sat in by the window, had a wobbly leg. I had tried to fix it myself, but it was beyond my limited skills. When I mentioned it to Michael, he offered to come by and take a look. The day he was due to arrive, I was a bundle of nerves. It was the first time another man besides a repairman had been inside my house since David had left. It felt like a test, a crossing of a threshold I wasn't sure I was ready for. He arrived with a small toolbox and a bag of lemons from the tree in his backyard. He greeted my mother with a warmth and a gentle respect that immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Covington," he said, taking her hand. "Annetta tells me this chair is the best seat in the house. We can't have the Queen's throne being wobbly." My mother, who had been a wary, protective lioness since my ordeal began, visibly softened. She laughed, a sound I had not heard from her in a very long time. As Michael worked on the chair, his movements efficient and sure, he and my mother talked. He asked her about the photographs on the mantel, and she told him stories of my childhood, of Sarah's first steps. He listened, not with the polite impatience of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with a genuine, engaged interest. He was not threatened by our history. He was curious about it. He was a man comfortable enough in himself to simply exist in a house of women without needing to dominate the space. Later, as the three of us sat on the back porch drinking the lemonade my mother had made with his lemons, I watched them. I watched the way he listened to her, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the easy, unassuming way he occupied his space in the world. And I felt a profound sense of peace. This was what goodness looked like. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet, steady, and kind. As he was leaving, my mother squeezed my hand. "He's a good man, Annetta," she whispered. "His heart is quiet." Her approval was the final permission my own wounded heart needed. Even so, The ghosts of the past were not so easily banished. One evening, Michael and I were walking through the park when a car down the street backfired. The sound a loud, sharp crack in the twilight air. I flinched violently, my whole body tensing, my breath catching in my throat. I was instantly back in my old living room, bracing for the explosion of David's rage that would follow a dropped dish or a spilled drink. Michael stopped, his hand gently touching my arm. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I looked at him, my heart hammering, my face flushed with embarrassment for my own reaction. The old Annetta would have apologized, would have minimized her own feelings to soothe the man beside her, but the new Annetta was trying to learn a different language. "That sound just startled me," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't question it. He didn't press. He just nodded, his expression full of a deep, uncomplicated empathy. "Okay," he said, and his hand rested on my back for a moment, a gesture of pure, steadying comfort. "Let's just stand here a second." In his patience, in his refusal to treat my reaction as an inconvenience or a flaw, he gave me a profound gift. He gave me a safe place to put my fear. The day I finally told him was a quiet Saturday. We were working together in my garden, pulling weeds in a comfortable silence. "My marriage was very difficult," I said, the words coming out before I had even decided to speak them. I didn't look at him, keeping my eyes fixed on the dark soil in front of me. "My ex-husband, he was not a kind man. It took me a long time to leave. I'm still learning how to feel safe." I didn't say more. I didn't need to. I risked a glance at him. He had stopped weeding and was just looking at me, his expression unreadable. For a terrifying second, I thought I had made a mistake, that I had burdened him with the darkness he didn't want. But then he reached over, not to touch me, but to gently pull a stubborn weed from the spot I had been working on. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Annetta," he said, his voice quiet. "No one should have to feel unsafe in their own home. And I'm glad you're free now." And that was all. No judgment, no pity, no barrage of questions, just a simple, profound validation of my truth. It was in that moment, with our hands in the dirt and the sun on our backs, that I realized I was not just free from David. I was finally, truly beginning to heal. Another year passed, the seasons turning with a gentle healing rhythm. The woman I was becoming was a stranger to the woman I had been, and I welcomed her with open arms. My life, which had once been a small, barren island, was now a thriving continent, rich with connection and quiet joys. The house was no longer a museum of my husband's ego. It was a home, filled with the scent of my mother's baking, the sound of my daughter's laughter on the phone from college, and, more often, the steady, comforting presence of Michael. Our love story was written not in grand, dramatic chapters, but in small, gentle verses. Him leaving a bag of fresh tomatoes on my porch, me knitting him a warm scarf for the winter, our hands brushing as we worked side by side in the garden. The final scene of my old life, the one I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times, took place on a warm evening in late spring. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and gold. I was sitting on the back porch, a place I had once avoided because it was where David would hold court after work, a cigar in one hand, a glass of scotch in the other, lecturing me on my daily failures. Now, the porch was my favorite place. I had filled it with pots of geraniums and trailing ivy and had installed a comfortable wooden swing where Michael and I now sat, moving in a slow, easy rhythm. In the yard before us, my garden was in full glorious bloom. The riot of wildflowers I had planted was a testament to life's beautiful chaos. My mother, her back straight and strong, was showing Sarah home for the summer. the proper way to stake a sunflower that had grown heavy with its own radiant face. Their laughter, light and genuine, drifted towards us on the evening air, mingling with the sweet scent of the gardenias. My mother's face, now 2 years past the day it had borne his mark, was filled with a peace I hadn't seen since I was a little girl. The scar on her soul, and on mine, had finally begun to fade. I leaned my head against Michael's shoulder, his arm resting comfortably around me, and I watched the beautiful, ordinary scene unfold. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the long, dark, terrifying road out of a 30-year prison. The memory of the fear, of the suffocating silence, of David's cold eyes was still a part of me. It was a scar, a reminder of the battle I had fought and won, but it no longer had the power to hurt me. It was simply a part of my story. The chapter that made this one, the chapter of peace, feel so profoundly, miraculously sweet. And in that moment, a simple, powerful truth crystallized in my mind. For my entire adult life, I had believed that life and love had to be loud. My marriage to David was a cacophony of loud arguments, loud demands, and even louder, more punishing silences. It was a life of high drama, of constant, nerve-shredding noise. I thought that was what it meant to be alive, to be in a relationship. But this gentle scene before me, this was a different thing entirely. This was happiness. I had never known that happiness could be quiet. I had never known that it wasn't a roaring fire, but a steady, warm hearth. It wasn't a crashing wave, but a deep, calm sea. It was the feeling of a trusted hand in mine, the sound of my family's laughter on the breeze, the simple, profound peace of watching a sunset with a man who did not want to own me, but only to share the view. Michael must have felt the shift in my breathing, the deep sigh of contentment that escaped me. He turned his head and smiled at me. That same kind, crinkling smile that I had first seen at the garden center. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We had learned to speak a new language together, a language of comfortable silences and shared understanding. I smiled back, my heart full to bursting with a gratitude so immense it felt like a prayer. The moral of my story was not complicated. It was that life never, ever ends where we think it does. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives are waiting on the other side of the door we are most terrified to open. The path to that door can be long and difficult, paved with tears and fear and loss, but it is a journey worth taking. For the first time in my life, I was not bracing for a storm. I was simply enjoying the quiet warmth of the evening, and it was everything.